welcome, welcome everybody. And I'm here for also my colleague, Dr. Reed, who's running First Amendment Day today. We're really thrilled to have the Transparency Group help sponsor this particular discussion. I know they're having another event today that is not officially under the First Amendment umbrella, but we really welcome that. It's a repeat that I saw about a week or two ago. That was excellent. So we'll get right down to business so we have the most amount of time. But I just want to say one quick thing. I was reminded when this Transparency Group came into being, the quote from Justice Louis Brandeis, which is, sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants. And when I see what the Transparency Group is doing at UNC, that's kind of what I think about. Just shedding light, as my colleagues say, in places that need light shed. So without any more delay, let me introduce the panelists. The title today of the talk, the discussion is Contextualizing Student Speech and Assembly at UNC. Sarah Smith is here to join us. She is a feminist political geographer and professor of geography and environment at UNC. Her work is animated by a desire to understand how our ordinary lives put the work of territorialization in motion to change how we operate as scholars and teachers in academic spaces. And to think our discipline's core ideas more capaciously to engage with Black, Indigenous, anti-colonial, and queer of color jurisdictions. Hasham Amira is a graduate student in the Department of Economics. He's the former president of the Graduate Workers Union and has been involved with Students for Justice in Palestine and Graduate Students for Liberation of Palestine. And our moderator today is Christina Wong, in an undergraduate. She's an undergraduate student in American Studies and serves as the president of Affirmative Action Coalition, and she is also involved with transparency. I'll turn it over to Christina. Thank you. So mics are off.
Automatically on. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for those lovely introductions, and thank you to our hosts for welcoming us today. I'm so excited to be moderating this panel. So today we'll be talking about student movements at UNC and how it relates to free speech. And I think it's really important that we start by contextualizing the landscape that we are today. From the civil rights sit-ins for desegregate, from food worker strikes at Lenore for better working conditions for workers here at UNC, to the toppling of Silent Sam Monument. Disruption and assembly are really important and integral to UNC's history and how we understand where we are today, as well as bringing about change. So Professor Smith, I would love to hear about your knowledge, a geographer. How do you understand these movements and their impacts on the university community in relation to free speech on campus?
Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. The building I work in was named for our KKK leader, William L. Sanders, in 1922. This meant that until 2015, students came to take my class on political geography, walking through these doors and seeing this name, knowing that they were in a building named for somebody who promoted white violence against people of color, especially Black people. On my way to the building, I had to pass the Confederate monument dedicated in 1913 that was erected to reinforce the hierarchy of white supremacy. And it was student activism and student disruption, and mainly the labor of Black students on this campus, that took Saunders' name off my building and took down the Confederate monument. So on this campus, since the middle of the 20th century, it's actually only been student activism that made this big paper for all of us. I think about that every day, and I'm so grateful for student activists, and I feel like it's honor to get to know them over the years and be part of their protests. So this institution wasn't really made for a lot of us who are in this room today. It was actually made for the white enslaver, settler, landowning class. It wasn't made for almost everybody in this room, honestly. So we actually have to work really hard to make it a place where we can inhabit and learn without kind of feeling. So I feel like it's students who've been pushing us forward on that. This history is embedded in the landscape, but also in a lot of our procedures and assumptions and the way we uphold white supremacy in our values and who gets hired and who gets fired and all these other things that happen at this institution. So we really have to work to reshape it to meet our current needs. And I'm grateful for student activism for doing that.
Yeah, thank you so much for going to them. Passion, I also want to give you the opportunity as a grad worker and as a student organizer to also talk about how UNC history or student movement history has influenced the work that you do today.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. We definitely look for inspiration through previous student movements, and I do find myself, spending a lot of time reading news articles from back in the day, reading about all the different things that were happening. And the similarities are always striking. And sometimes they're also inspiring in a sense. So if you all don't know, during the South African apartheid movement on campus, something very similar to what happened in April happened at UNC, where students set up, it wasn't an encampment, it was these shanty towns that referred to the shanty towns in South Africa. And I think the administration was a bit more tolerant at the beginning than our administration and let them stay for a bit. But they said they're not leaving until UNC divests from South African apartheid or they get arrested. What happened? They got arrested. So really, in that sense, what we're doing is not novel or revolutionary or, it's something that we do for a while. And we are inspired by it, and we're inspired by the leaders of this. And something that I'm really hoping to get done either by the end of this semester or sometime next semester is to actually have leaders from those movements come and speak to us and speak about the divestment push in 84 to 88. Because they are quite truly inspiring. And for them, it was just like for many of us today, they felt like there was something bigger for them, something that they needed to pursue despite what personal cost comes at. I recognize a couple of faces in this room who had to face personal costs for their activism. And that's what it means to care. That's what it means to be empathetic. And I think that's really the most fundamental aspect of why we do this. I also want to talk a little bit about Silent Sam. It's also, when I was reading about that and learning about that, it's very recent. It's very fresh. Similar things happen, protests, disruptions, and because the university wasn't going to move. It's an institution built and is steeped in a history of racism, colonialism, and yes, if you go, the chancellor at the time, she said she had personal objections to having the statue on campus, but fundamentally, the institution itself is complicit, and the laws of the state are complicit. And individuals who are unwilling to exert, once you become a chancellor, to be a chancellor, you probably has to be someone who's willing to put your personal values and beliefs on the side just to play into the system. And we see people in admin who are outright conservative, or sometimes I would even argue fascist. And then you see members of the administration who actually care, but are still complicit because they would not be in that position if they were not to play the game that is expected of them to play. If they don't bow down to the legislature, if they don't bow down to the right-wing board of trustees. So I think for us, it's about highlighting that difference, and it's been there. Vietnam, South Africa, Silent Sam, the housekeepers, all these different actions. It's been there, it's still there, it's going to be there until we fundamentally change the system, which we have not done and we're not close to doing.
Yeah, thank you. And I look forward to that conversation with previous student organizers who have put their bodies and safety on the line. And I think if we talk to these student organizers, I think there's definitely parallels talking about how the university has cracked down on free speech, or how the university has arrested students in retaliation for them speaking out. And interesting enough, in 2024, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression ranked UNC 174 out of 248, saying that it is slightly below average in terms of free speech on campus. I want to draw upon both of your fields and experiences. How do we understand this score and the current campus climate?
One thing that's been interesting to me since I started attending the Students for Justice in Palestine protests, or protesters or speaking at a press release or whatever. Since those things happened, it was really interesting to me that I got like WhatsApp messages or I ran into folks on campus and they said, you know, I'm international faculty and I don't feel safe attending a protest because of my visa status. Or as junior faculty of color, I don't feel like I can speak up in front of a crowd like you can because you're white, because you're tenured. And I was so struck by that and thinking about what it means to be faculty of color. This is your first year on the job and you don't even feel like you can speak up against the genocide. Like what kind of free speech do we have if somebody with a tenure track position feels like they're gonna face sanctions just if they speak up against kids getting killed? That's preposterous to me. I was shocked when folks said that to me. I mean, I guess I wasn't shocked, but I was really moved by them saying that. Statements from, one thing that I'll just say quite frankly is that we get these statements from the administration about anti-Semitism. And I think anti-Semitism is on the rise and it's so horrifying and it's closely tied to white nationalism. It's not closely tied to students protesting for justice in Palestine. I feel really frustrated when free speech becomes limited in this way or when it becomes about anti-Semitism, because I remember the Unite the Right rally where there were white nationalists saying Jews will not replace us, which was white nationalists coming on campus in Virginia. And then we have very similar folks here. So we have these neo-Nazis who used to come on campus when we had Silent Sam, and they would come on campus with the Confederate flag with Nazi tattoos. And we were told that they had freedom of speech, and even the police would kind of like keep them safe. So I find it very frustrating and disingenuous when folks' free speech gets curtailed now because of kind of like, I feel like false allusions to anti-Semitism. Getting used as kind of like, we're making this place unsafe for Jewish students. My daughter attended her first Shabbat services at the Gaza encampment, and there were so many like Jewish faculty, staff, and students there who were speaking up for Palestine. So I feel like some of the free speech conversation has gotten really messy and complicated, and that certain myths are used to speak back to people who are actually just speaking up for justice. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah, I mean, the current climate on campus, I think, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. One, there's the right-wing takeover of the university, which is undeniable, and I think a majority of the campus community sees it, acknowledges it. But I also think part of the issue that we see is that many facets of campus still go business as usual despite it. And like, there's no clear answer, obviously, of like, how do we deal with this? Like, Transparency does wonderful work, SAC does wonderful work, all these different organizations on campus do wonderful work to bring light, as you said, to the issues that's happening on campus. And that is important work. A challenge is to get the mobilization from the center, so to speak, which I think is sympathetic. And I think we need to find ways to involve them, even though, they share our frustrations, but they remain apathetic. And like, a part of me thinks, I don't blame them. I was never really that much of a student activist before the genocide in Gaza began. So I'm guilty of that. Something had to radicalize me, so to speak. It took a genocide in my case, a genocide against my own people. So I'm guilty of it too. And I think that, we should be reflecting on how do we change the campus climate of apathy? How do we get, and it's a tough question, and I think we don't really know the answer to it, and we should be thinking about. I want to add something about the accusations of anti-Semitism on campus. It is kind of frustrating, but also amusing that certain individuals in faculty, were using anti-Semitism as a way to suppress pro-Palestine voices. And the name that comes to mind is specifically Provost Chris Clemens. because he's been using that argument up and down the wall. But something that I think more and more people are learning about now is that Chris Clemens was the faculty advisor for a self-professed white supremacist group on campus here at UNC before they were disbanded. Look it up, Google Chris Clemens Youth for Western Civilization. That's the name of the group. They were disbanded, and then when he was confronted by the media about it, he said, "Oh, I didn't read their national charter. I just wanted to promote diversity of discourse, the same bullshit language he uses for the new school, diversity of discourse." When in reality, they're trying to promote, that organization was explicitly promoting a far-right supremacist ideas that were clearly and explicitly anti-Semitic. So you see this trying to, it's a strategy we've seen for decades, where the conflation of fighting for Palestinian rights and anti-Semitism is the first thing we hear. And it is quite frankly irresponsible by the university to be equating, because they said there were incidents where someone, I can't remember what it was, someone drew a swastika on someone's door, or something like that. Can't remember the details. And they said that in the email, in response to taking down the UNC solidarity encampment. That's irresponsible. The people at the encampment had nothing to do with that incident. And obviously an incident like that should be tolerated, but conflating the two is very irresponsible and defamatory against the student movement. And at the same time, a Palestinian, a UNC health police officer was filmed he was filmed spitting on the Palestinian flag at one of the protests, an employee, and we got zero response from that. In fact, he had one earlier in the year, he had one Officer of the Year in January, and we found it on UNC Health's Instagram. So a bunch of us started commenting, like, this man needs to be fired. There were also allegations that he said at the protest after he beat someone up, he said, "You're next, F slur." So you see like this adamant homophobia and xenophobia, Islamophobia from UNC police and UNC health police that is completely unaddressed publicly or privately, as far as we know. And you see this insane double standard, and they hide behind, free speech, et cetera, when in reality, that's not what's happening. And actually, when we started commenting on the Instagram page, they actually deleted all the comments and locked down the comments on that post, which I think, according to their interpretation of the law, a public institution limiting comments on a post is actually an infringement of free speech. So they're literally infringing our free speech and then using free speech as a way to promote, literal genocidal campaigns on campus, like genocidal groups on campus and white nationalist groups. So I think that really captures the climate on this campus and the contradiction that exists that I think a lot of us feel and are aware of, but it's hard to bring it all together and really put it as like one whole package. And I think that's what's really frustrating for a lot of us in the movement, I would say.
Yeah, thank you so much for both your comments. And you can definitely see the ways that free speech is applied to some groups and not some groups, as you were saying. And what comes to mind is, for me, is UNC employing police. They brutalized students in response to the Gaza solidarity encampments. And they said it was a disruption to campus operations, threats to safety. And firstly, if you were to stumble across the encampment, you would see people dancing, there's music. And you also brought your children. A lot of people brought their kids because how community-centered it was. So to use a disproportionate response in comparison to actual threats, where we talk about San Sam, when white supremacists openly carried guns and police knew, but chose not to arrest, which is a felony. Open carrying on campus is a felony. When students during Duke games burn things near or on campus, no one is punished. But students setting up camps caused police to brutalize, to attack students. I I would like to talk to you both about this use of safety and how it's been used, weaponized to suppress speech.
Yeah, if you know me, you know I talk about my kid all the time. I'm so sorry. So I have a 12-year-old daughter, and she's like my whole heart, and she's also a guiding moral force in my life, and in the world. And her dad is from Ladakh, my husband, so that's like, oh, you're not gonna know where that is. That's way up in the Himalayas, and it's on the border with Pakistan and China. It's a contested area where there've been several territorial wars. So when I heard about the encampment, my husband was actually back in India, and I knew I had to go, and so I knew, of course, I had to take her. So we went to the encampment together on Friday, and we spent almost the whole weekend there, actually, until Sunday evening, and then I was like, okay, I was like, okay, kid, you have to go home because you have school tomorrow. She's like, no, I don't want to go home. I like it here. Everybody's so nice. At this dangerous encampment. So I took her home, and the reason I took her there is because I wanted her to know when colonized people are oppressed, we stand up no matter what. I just felt like it's part of her political education, and I want her to know that from the time she's little. I don't want it to be a question. I don't want her to later learn that this happened and that we weren't there. I want her to be there and feel what it's like and stand up, that we don't just like watch kids get killed and just let it. So that camp was so safe for her and such a transformative experience. She talks about it all the time. She just like people recognize her. Like we were like getting tacos the other day, and somebody's like, "Hi, like hi Sasha, like how is that?" Like catching up with her because they haven't seen her since the encampment. She made little presents for some of the student activists. She knows what their favorite colors and animals are. She just loved it there. She went to teach-ins. She learned how to make prints. She just had such a good experience. So then when I saw the university response where they had destroyed the camp and they said it was dirty and dangerous, you can imagine how I felt. I was so mad. We had them like picking up the trash and carrying it to the dumpster. And then there were like, made sure that there were like Band-Aids for people where somebody had their like gluten-free whatever they need or whatever. There was like so much love and care. I even remember this time I was teasing people about where people brought mustard greens, which like look like lettuce, but it's spicy. So they put like a little sign saying spicy. I was like, they don't even want somebody to accidentally eat spicy lettuce. Like, how sweet is that? Or else can you go and somebody's gonna give you food and make sure you're not gonna have an allergic reaction for free? So I was thinking about that, and then when I see the university response, every day I see these pictures of kids getting killed and like men and women trying to stop them from getting killed, and all this effort going into taking care of those kids. And then I've told this story before, like when I see those things, I think about like the little kid next door who broke her arm and how we were all so devastated that she broke her arm. And then that made me think about how when my daughter just like smashes her knee or gets a splinter, I feel like everything has to stop till we splinter out. And I was thinking how for me, when the students are responding to the teen genocide, they see those kids as like their kids or their little brother or sister, and those parents as could be their parent, and they just want that to stop. It makes me get upset every time. Anyway, it makes me so angry that what's actually a response to try to stop violence is portrayed as an act of violence. I think it's really malicious, and we have to really take care with that. So that's, I don't remember what the question was, but basically it was such a space of love and care that I feel like it's sort of like a landmark for her life as a child that she'll always remember. And I'm furious with how it was represented. There was no violence of anybody who was there. There was no violence until the police showed up. And then there was a lot of violence and very, very. So that's what I have to say.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think about tents specifically, and this is a perfect response. In my first year here, for about a year, every Friday, my friends and I would set up a tent and on the quad, and it says Free Advice Fridays. We just chill, do things. Not a single person ever talked to us from it. Yes, it's a rules on the boats, but who cares, right? The minute it had a political implication, then it was a different story. then violence was excusable by the university against the protesters. So you definitely do see that, there's a double standard, there's always a double standard when it comes to free speech, especially around Palestine, or anything that challenges the status quo that exists in the state, on this campus, and in this country. And then the question of safety, I think it's a very disingenuous thing. I mean, we literally, throughout the encampment, I think on pretty much every day except the Sabbath, we had these right-wing Zionist families would show up, try to be disruptive, play Zionist music, and they would do it in the middle of the encampment. And we just let them, and there were little kids. Someone brought little kids from people who we think, these are, I think you made the point, like, there was a lot of Jewish students, there was a lot of, there was a Shabbat service, there was all sorts of different things. And those are Jews that we politically agree with, right? Those are usually non-Zionist or anti-Zionist Jews who are leaders and play a critical role in the movement. There were also Jews who came to disrupt the encampment that were against us, hardcore right-wing Zionists, and they were able to still come in the middle of the encampment, play their music. I have video on my phone of them doing it, and these little kids, and I feel bad for these kids. They're being brainwashed by this insane ideology. And I remember I was just chatting up with these kids because I was like, they're innocent, they don't know better. I was like, maybe I can plant a seed where like one day it'll make them question things. Because we do know that a lot of Jewish young people in America, and there's a film called Israelism that you can watch that really shows when they start learning about Palestine and about Zionism outside of what they're usually used to, they kind of start realizing like, oh, okay, I never got a just representation of what's happening in Palestine. So I kind of thought like, oh, engaging with someone at a young age is actually valuable. So you see, like, they felt comfortable enough to be in the middle of the encampment, hardcore Zionists, Jews, and then, they walked off, they did their little live stream, they played their music, and then they left. And that was the end of it. They were not harassed. If anything, they were harassing us. And they were still able to do it, yet, Lee Roberts will be like, oh, it's a threat to safety, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's so stupid and disingenuous. And, they're going to play this game, and we should not let them. We should always be trying to fight that narrative.
Ask a follow-up question. I want to ask, as a student that was retroactively suspended, could you discuss the extinctions imposed on student protesters and how the broader implications for students' right to protest?
Yeah. So I kind of want to mention something you mentioned. I'm an international student. So when we strategize on like who's willing to stay at the encampment and get arrested, et cetera, that was not an option for me. But the university managed to target me with bullshit allegations and try to suspend me. I was the only one who was actually suspended without any criminal charges because they literally had nothing. Because I followed all the rules because I did not want to get my visas, issues. But they still were able to target me, and I saw the disclosure of all the information of what was happening behind the scenes. It's very clear, explicit targeting, and we see that happening now. There's one student who's actually Jewish, who UNC is refusing to provide a path to get them unsuspended. They've pretty much offered everyone a deal, including the counter-protesters who were filmed on video beating down on someone. They were offered deals to get their suspensions removed. But this one student who did not commit any violent acts, he's Jewish, but someone in admin clearly has a personal vendetta against him. They're not offering him a path towards their unsuspension. So, the university is still doing this. The university is actively trying to suppress voices, especially voices that make it inconvenient for their narrative. So, we see a lot of backlash. We've heard from, in multiple meetings, it was mentioned explicitly that the reason, even though there were discussions about reforming honor court, the reason it was done was specifically because of what happened in April. So, there is like a clear consolidation of power that is unabashed, and, it's not even thinly veiled, like, they just took the veil off. And I think something that highlights this is when they decided to cut short the chancellor selection process, because we all knew from day one that Lee Roberts was going to be the permanent chancellor. I bet most people in this room felt that day. We knew it was going to happen, and then I think they realized halfway through the summer that we all know it, they know it. What's the point of continuing with the lie that there is a process that is democratic or transparent, and they just cut it short? So I think the boards, the leadership of this university that goes to the board of governors, the president of the system, the board of trustees, they realize they have unlimited power and unchecked power, and they're going to exercise it to accelerate the right-wing takeover of this university without even pretending to care about shared governance, about transparency, about things like that. And I think that really puts into perspective what's really happening on this campus.
Yeah, thank you so much for those insights, and I'm very glad that these charges were dismissed, but I'm sure there was a lot of mental and emotional turmoil that was unnecessary cause. Professor Smith, I also wanted to ask if you wanted to comment as a faculty member.
I guess the answer I wrote down is kind of weird. Question. I think what I was thinking about is I teach political geography, and what I like to do with political geography, y'all don't know what that is, but traditionally it's a very white field. In fact, it didn't even used to have girls in it. Like when I was in grad school, I would go to the conference and I'd be like, wait, am I the only woman in this room? What's happening? Do women not like politics? Anyway, I kind of made it my mission to bring in Black and Indigenous theory into political geography, because the way that it was like really frustrating to me, because I felt like they bring that in as like little sprinkles on top. When Black theory and Indigenous theory gives us actually a whole theory of the world and politics, which I find really compelling. So the point of that is I'm teaching these classes where I'm talking about Black geographies show us how our idea of the human was made in relation to anti-Blackness through the history of slavery. And then I'm teaching, how settler colonialism gives us this illusion of land to be taken. And so if students are like taking these really important ideas and then they're using them to try to change our campus because they see the connections between the ways that people have been oppressed, or the ways that Native people have been erased from this place. And then they're taking this up in terms of activism, and they're getting punished for it. I don't know. I'm always going to side with the students. You already know I'm really grateful for all the students' work on this campus. And I think it's really ridiculous. Like something that I told the administration, like in different meetings where I got a chance to talk to higher ups, I told them, like, who you're suspending is like the best students in our classes. Like the ones who do the reading and then they come to the office hours and ask for more reading. Like those are the kind of students who you arrested. So what you doing? Bring them back. I don't know what else.
Yeah, thank you. And so when it comes to like, when I think of civil disobedience, it's a word that's usually put after the fact. Years down the road, when we historicize these events, and then universities like, oh shoot, we're wrong. So when I think about events that are happening now, protests that are happening now, they are not labeled with terms civil disobedience. They're like, there's not safe, there's the disruptions, and then violent discipline. So like, do you see this in current movements and past movements, and how do we go beyond that?
I think this is something we've all been talking about, right? How people look to kind of disruptions that happened in the past, and now it's like, oh yeah, of course, everybody would have been on their side at that time, We all love Martin Luther King now. So I just feel like it is really similar. I also just think that we all pay taxes, we pay tuition, or we receive, in my case, I receive a paycheck from this institution. So it's actually our civic duty to find out where that money is going. And I am so happy to pay for taxes that pay for the public schools my kid goes to and other people's kids go to, and Pell Grants if we still have them, and, free lunch for kids, I will just pay taxes like crazy. But I'm not paying for bombs and like little kids to get massacred. It's like actually our duty to look into that and pressure every institution we're related to do better.
Yeah, I mean, we see this a lot, and we see this. Nelson Mandela was labeled a terrorist by the U.S. until 2008. It goes beyond, it's very extreme. And now, in hindsight, it's like, oh, Nelson Mandela, we have statues, we have busts of him everywhere. Same goes for MLK. So all these leaders, mind you, who were successful. If a movement is not successful, which happens sometimes, those leaders are not going to be looked at with the same hindsight that we see for those leaders, right? And that's the reality, is that we have to keep fighting until we succeed. Otherwise, we're going to be labeled as history is written by the victor. So we do see that, and I also kind of want to highlight acts of civil disobedience, or acts of disruption are necessary. I could go stand on the quad and scream my brains out for weeks, and nothing's going to happen. And I'm not saying that disruption is definitely guaranteed to affect change, but at least it's getting coverage. And the walkthrough that happened last week that was organized by SJP. I think there's a lot of criticism that's happening, and there's also a conversation going within SJP about what is it exactly that we're trying to achieve, and is our strategy achieving that goal? And sometimes it's hard to tell, right? Because it's like, even though maybe people feel uncomfortable with SJP's tactics, at the same time, SJP's tactics are creating a conversation, right? So there's this constant tension around civil disobedience, about acts of civil disobedience. When is it too far? When you start hurting your own movement? And there's definitely a consistent attempt to try to portray divestment from Israel as an unpopular thing. And Lee Roberts went on a radio interview in a local radio station. He said, "Well, there was agreement on South Africa. There's no agreement on Palestine." And actually, there wasn't agreement on South Africa. There were bigger counter protests then, but he's not someone who reads clearly. He hasn't looked into the history. He's not an academic, he's not. Yeah, literally, the transparency. He doesn't do anything in Florida, right? So there was massive not massive. I mean, they were smaller than the protests, but there were counter protests by two groups: college Republicans in the 80s, and another group, something Freedom USA, and what it was. They were protesting the anti-apartheid movement because they were pro-apartheid, or whatever. It's like, oh, we should not intervene. That's their excuse. And I honestly think, even though there's a lot of people who, buy into oh, SJP's tactics are inappropriate, and whatnot. And maybe some of these people are vocal. I do think that divestment is a popular opinion on campus among the majority of students. I genuinely think that. And you see that, maybe this doesn't mean much, but the other day, SJP received a Peacemaker Award from a UNC organization. And then the DTH yesterday, the Daily Target, or local newspaper, posted an article about it on their Instagram. And last time I checked, they had 1,400 likes, more likes than most of their posts. So yeah, maybe people are uncomfortable and question our tactics, but I also think people might be conflicted, but I think there is a lot of support for SJP that we might not recognize, despite the tactics that some might consider, walking through a building and disrupting classes. Someone might think that's super problematic, but it does get to the point where it's we're starting a conversation, we're showing that your feelings of discomfort are valid, and then really sit with those feelings of discomfort, but then also reflect about how they pale in comparison to the Palestinian students in Gaza whose livelihood was destroyed, who have been living in tents for a year, who have almost no access to clean water or electricity, whose livelihood was completely destroyed in an act of genocide. And I like, put that into perspective, put your discomfort and then put that into perspective. And I think when people really think about that, when I have these conversations with people, they're like, oh shit, yeah. That does make sense. My feeling of discomfort is necessary. And I think the feeling of discomfort also comes from the idea of not wanting to sit with the feelings of the injustice. Because, I mean, trust me, as someone who wakes up and thinks about it every day, it fucking sucks. It's not a happy life to be thinking about this constantly. So I get when people want to run away from these emotions, but if we want to affect change, we have to bring out these emotions in folks. And sometimes that requires civil disobedience and disruptions, and that's just the reality.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely think that's a way to change campus climate of putting things into those spaces that would have discomfort and have these conversations. And I think you kind of answered my last question, which is about like why we students who know the consequences go beyond the First Amendment rights. And so since you answered that question and articulated so well, give Professor Smith an opportunity to answer.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo this, I was thinking, you know, I was at the walkthrough and everything, and I'm old, I'm faculty. Like, one thing is, I'm never gonna comment on what is and isn't appropriate student tactics, because I don't know how to change the world. So I'm just here to kind of like back up the students and hope that their impulses are right. But I also think like, it's preposterous to again, like, wake up and see kids getting killed and then think a little bit of spray paint is the problem. That's just disgusting to me. It's just disgusting. I don't have any patience for that. The other thing is that I think it's preposterous to act like universities are gonna crumble if we don't invest in the military. I just think that's ridiculous that that's the norm. I don't even know why this is a conversation, or why when we talked to admin, they said, no, it's really complicated. I mean, I have to retire someday, so my like nickels and pennies, I take to a guy and I'm like, I need to invest for retirement. I don't want to invest in Israel. I don't want to invest in fossil fuels. I don't want to invest in XYZ. Here's a long list of things that I want no part of. And then he listens to me because it's my money. That's his job, right? And they got $5 billion. I don't have any $5 billion, but like, I'm going to make sure that my nickels aren't going to the wrong things. Like, the university can take some responsibility. It's just ridiculous to think that we can't have a university if we don't invest in war. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. I don't know why we think that's normal.
I think we want to comment.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, you know, the definitions of, you know, of free speech and what counts as free speech. You know, I think we have a, you know, I think civil disobedience in itself should also be protected, right? Right, like, because it's always, you know, after the fact, you know, MLK was arrested, was jailed more than 30 times. Nelson Mandela languished in prisons for years, right? So we think about these examples and it's like, we're always going to be fighting injustice. I think, you know, some people have an idealistic thing where like we could achieve like a true, I think we're always going to be fighting structural injustice. It's just a fact of humanity, I think. And maybe in 1,000 years that might be different if we survive until then. Doubtful. Sorry, I'm getting on a tangent. But the point is that I think we need more protections for fighting for rights that go beyond free speech. Especially today, as free speech is becoming even easier and easier to ignore. When free speech is becoming more and more put in bubbles, where when I make my speech vocal, it's only people who usually agree with me are the ones who are listening to me. You know, I bet a majority of the people in this room are like, yeah, I think that encampment was great. But those are not the people that I'm trying to reach, no offense. Like, there are other people that I would love to have a conversation with, but free speech is not enough. And like, you know, I could be doing a better job reaching out to them and whatnot, but the way social systems are structured do not make that easy. And that's when, you know, I think you need to lean into acts of civil disobedience to really affect discourse. And I think that should be protected as well.
Yeah, thank you. As I start closing out this panel, I wanted to ask, we're talking about frustrations and even discuss with the university, what action items or call on for the audience members, what can we do? It's a big question, but
That's always a tough one. I think talk to the people who you know you can get them to become more active or like more on the right side, but are not quite there yet. And that's really tough. But it's also something you get better the more you do of. So I think there's like a personal ask, which is like talk to the people in your life. And it's not going to be comfortable, but you know, it's an exercise in empathy as well on your part because you know, I had fucked up beliefs growing up. I was a homophobe when I grew up, and now I'm gay. Like, and you know that helped me in the sense that it showed me that oh, a lot of my beliefs were messed up, and I had something had to confront me. I had to deal with that. So it's something that is not comfortable, and it's an exercise for us in empathy of being like, I get that this is your perspective, but let's really have a genuine conversation to affect change, and I think that's an important step. Another ask is you know, if you're not involved in the organizing, try to get involved. Find the cause you care about. Find a group of people you get along with, because part of being able to organize is also to like the people you're working with, to be honest. So yeah, try to get involved. I think that's my ask.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. Those are great. I mean, I do agree that people change their mind. That's why I love teaching. And I agree with the empathy part too, because I've seen students who, the first day of class, they're very skeptical, like, I don't have white privilege because X. And then I've seen like through just conversations and meeting folks where they are and listening to their perspectives, people do change minds, which is very rewarding. And also just, I think we all should show up as we can when people ask us to.
thank you so much. I think we should have time for one or two questions, if anybody has questions for our amazing panelists. If not, can we get a round of applause? Thank you so much for everyone for being here. Yeah, taking the time out of your day to listen to this panel. And if you have any questions, you can also come up individually. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Recording. Oh, sure.
Sorry, I can't come to the thing.
Hi, Amanda. Yes, okay, I'm.
When I sat down, I thought,
I didn't.
I didn't-